Welcome to this video about writing your literature review from the study advice team at the University of Reading. In today's video, we're going to try to describe the purpose of a literature review and outline a step-by-step plan for completing a literature review. And part of that is going to be about how to structure your literature review. So it's probably a good idea to start by reminding ourselves of the purpose of a literature review and what this section of the dissertation is for. A good literature review should critically discuss the relevant research in your field and demonstrate how your research fits into that area. Ideally, your study should be building on or filling a gap in the current research. Also, as you write your literature review, it's really important to keep in mind that the research and the findings that you include in this section will be used as a point of comparison for your own results. And that comparison will take place in your discussion chapter. So these two chapters are actually really closely linked. So that's what a literature review does. Let's look at how we write one. So a literature review can sometimes seem like quite a daunting and overwhelming task at times. And so it's a good idea, as with any large task, to try and break it down into more manageable chunks. And one of the ways that you can do that is by following the 5-step plan that I've got outlined for you here on this slide. Now the steps begin with making sure that you first of all defined your research problem carefully. And the second step is about researching and reading critically, followed by organising your themes. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. In step 4, structuring and planning your work, leads into step 5, writing it up section by section. So now we're going to have a look at each of these steps in a little bit more detail, and in particular focusing on steps 3 through to 5, as this video is mostly about planning, structuring and writing your literature review. So step 1 was about defining your research problem. It might be that you've already done this and you've already collected all of your relevant papers, but before you start planning and writing your literature review, it might be a good idea to remind yourself about what your research problem is. A Venn diagram can be a useful way of looking at a research problem. In this example, the student's interested in 3 different overlapping research areas: teenagers and their experiences, social media, and the development of anxiety. Mapping out these areas has helped the student to identify their research problem, which here is taken the form of a question. Is there a link between use of social media and the development of anxiety in teenagers? Sketching out a Venn diagram might be something that you want to try just to help you visualise the main topic areas of your work, and displaying this somewhere around your workstation might be useful to keep you on track as you write your literature review. Once you've defined your research areas and your specific research problem, it's time to start reading. And it's important to remember that when you read a paper, you shouldn't simply be recording what that paper did and what that paper found out. You need to keep your eyes open for things such as gaps in the literature or common themes. Now, a gap in the literature could be something that keeps being overlooked or missed. So, for example, perhaps teenagers are often missing in the research associated to social media and anxiety. Don't worry though if you're struggling to find a gap in the literature. There will be one somewhere. It doesn't necessarily have to be a great big gap. It might just be something small that's been overlooked, and that's still valid. In terms of themes are things like common findings or areas of agreement among theorists, things that keep cropping up across the range of papers that you read. If you've already gathered papers for your literature review and you feel like you haven't identified themes or gaps, this might be a step of the literature review process that you need to return to. And don't worry about that. Just take another look at your papers, this time with your critical hat on, and see if you can pull out any themes or any gaps. So on this next slide, I just wanted to show you an example of how you can make notes on the papers that you read to record not only what the paper found out, but to start asking yourself critical questions about the paper that might help you identify some of these common themes and gaps that we've been talking about. This student here has used a table to make notes on the papers that she's reading, and she has a row in a table for each paper. Now, you don't have to make notes this way. Find a style that works for you, but perhaps try using some of the principles that we can see here. Let's have a look at what our student is doing here in a little bit more detail. So firstly, our student has recorded the full reference for her paper in the table. That's a good idea in case she loses her original copy. She's also, in the second column, recorded what the paper has found out that might be relevant for her literature review, and there's two main findings that she's identified there. Firstly, she's identified that teenagers seem to be at greatest risk of mental health issues associated to social media. That's what this paper is saying. Secondly, this paper is also suggesting that children will continue to use social media even after bad experiences. Now let's look at what she's doing in the last column. So she's taking each of those findings and questioning them. So for her first finding, she's questioning why is it that teenagers are so susceptible? And this has led her to another research paper by Broom, who found out something similar. So she's unearthed a common theme there. She's also asked questions about the second finding of the paper. Why would children choose to remain online after bad experiences? So after going off and looking for more papers and searching for the literature, she's actually not been able to find an answer to that. So she's come across a gap in the literature there. So we can see that note making in some form like this can help you to identify themes and gaps in your literature, but it's also a really good way of helping you to visualize how all of your research papers fit together. So it might be something that you want to try out before writing up your literature review. Now I've got an activity that I want you to do based on these first two steps that we've looked at. In a moment, this video is going to pause and you're going to have the opportunity to fill in a form and record some information about your dissertation. And it's a good activity just to get you thinking about these first two steps in writing a dissertation. I want you to think about what are your main topic areas. Remember the example that we looked at here, the student was investigating teenagers, social media, and the development of anxiety. What are your topic areas? Have those topic areas led you to a research question yet? And if you've done some reading, have you been able yet to identify any key themes in your reading or any gaps in your literature? So this video will pause in a moment and give you an opportunity to fill in a form where you answer these questions. Okay, so hopefully that activity gave you an opportunity to think a little bit more about your own dissertation. Now, when you get to the stage where if you've defined your research problem, you've found and you've read some papers with a critical eye, looking out for gaps and common themes, then you're ready to move on to step number 3, organising your themes. Now, by this stage, you've probably read lots and lots of papers and identified plenty of different themes. So you need to turn your attention to organising those themes, particularly if you've got a lot of them. And a good way to do this is to start grouping them together and thinking about which themes are similar to each other and which themes are different to each other. Perhaps some of the themes that you've come across are actually more relevant to the things that you want to study, your research problem. So you might find that you discard some themes at this point, which is perfectly normal. To help you organise your themes, it's also sometimes a good idea to try and visualise them by drawing a mind map or something similar. So now that you've identified themes, you've grouped them together and decided which are the most relevant to your work, it's time to plan your structure. In general, I think it's best to avoid a chronological structure with an introduction, a summary of paper 1, summary of paper 2, a summary of paper 3, and then a conclusion. because using that structure, I think, can cause you to fall into the trap of writing a descriptive literature review that merely describes what each paper did and what each paper found before moving on to the next paper. And I'd recommend moving away from a structure like that and more towards what I've got on the next slide. So something like this, a structure that's organised by theme. So here we have an introduction, and then a section to talk about the first theme, and then a section to talk about the second theme and the third theme, and so on, and then a conclusion. Now, a literature review ought to be critical, really, and you should be demonstrating your ability to synthesize and make links between papers, and this is best done by using this kind of structure. With this structure, you have the opportunity to discuss one theme at a time, and each theme discusses several papers at once, so it's giving you more opportunities to compare and contrast those papers and to write critically, which is obviously what your markers want to see. Just be aware, though, that here in this example I've used 3 themes, but that's not a defined rule. I'd recommend maybe 3 or 4 or 5 themes, but I suppose how many you have is going to depend on your subject area and also the word count that you have. So next, we have to consider which theme we want to put first. You've already grouped your themes together and you've already thought about which ones are the most relevant to your study. So use that work that you've already done to help you decide which theme to discuss first. And if you're struggling with this, it can be useful to think about the structure of a literature review, kind of like an upside down triangle. And I'm going to try and show you what I mean on the next slide. So let's start by looking at the overall structure of a literature review, which, as well as discussing all your themes, should include an introduction, a main body where you're going to discuss those key themes, and a conclusion. And the idea is that a literature review ought to start off broadly, and moving through the main body of the literature review becomes progressively more relevant to what you want to study as you go towards the conclusion of the literature review. So here's how to do that in the main body section. Now the idea is that as the reader progresses through this section, each theme that you discuss becomes more and more relevant to the specific area that you wish to research, to your research question or problem. So you're using relevance as a way of deciding which theme to talk about first. So we start with theme 1, which is quite broad, and then theme 2, which becomes a bit more relevant, and then theme 3, which is super relevant to the problem of your project. And this is a really good way to structure your work if you're unsure about what to talk about first. And it also has the advantage of offering quite a convincing argument to your reader, as they can tell that your literature review is going somewhere and that it's got a point. So while we're here, let's have a look at what ought to go into the other 2 sections that we have sandwiched around the main body, the introduction and the conclusion. We'll start with the introduction. So in the introduction section, we definitely want to include a bit of the broader context for your research area. And you can do this by identifying the common and relevant debates in that area of knowledge and the main concepts relating to that field of research. So in other words, what's going on currently in that area of research? Also, don't forget in this section to provide the reader with some indication of the structure that the literature review will take and the key themes that you're going to discuss. That'll just provide some signposting for your reader and help them not to feel so lost in your work. Finally then, in terms of structure, let's think about what goes into the conclusion section of the literature review. Now, this section of the literature review should feel quite predictable to the reader because you're summarising the key findings that you've already discussed in the main body. You're also reminding the reader of the gaps, the problems and the barriers that you've already identified in the main body section. So that should lead you nicely to the end of your conclusion, where you can discuss how your study is going to build on or fill in those gaps that you've identified. So as you write the literature review, your reader should be able to get a sense of this upside down triangle shape, as the literature review starts off broadly and then becomes more and more relevant to a specific problem, before arriving neatly at a conclusion that tells us what ought to happen next. Now that might be a proposal for a new study if you're doing the kind of dissertation that requires you to take data. Alternatively, if you're doing a desk-based study, then that might look like recommendations for future studies or recommendations for practice. So that brings us to the final step of writing up a literature review. Now that you have an idea of what is going into the different sections of your literature review, you're ready to start writing it up. And you'll probably find that easier if you break down that writing activity into little chunks and tackle your literature review one section at a time. So you could start with the introduction and then the first paragraph of the first theme, the second paragraph of the first theme, and so on. Remember that the research that you discuss in the literature review will be compared with your own results in the discussion section if you're doing the type of dissertation where you take data. And in that case, there's probably not much point trying to perfect your literature review at this stage before you've finished writing the rest of your project and analysing your data. Something interesting or unexpected could crop up in your results, which could mean that you would need to rework the literature review to shift the focus more towards a particular theme or idea that's relevant to that unexpected finding. So what I would recommend is, at this stage, try to get a few drafts under your belt first of all, and then continue with other parts of your project, particularly if you're taking data. Just don't forget to do some of that final editing of the literature review before you hand it in. So let's finish with a summary, because we've talked about quite a few different things in this video. So a literature review can sometimes seem like a bit of an overwhelming task, so you might want to try breaking it down into steps. And if you do that, I would recommend that you start by making sure that you're clear on what your research problem is, and start reading some papers, keeping an eye open for key themes and gaps in the literature. Once you've identified some key themes, and they're really important, see if you can start to group them and use them to plan your structure. And then when you've done that, you're ready to progress to that final stage of literature review production, which is where you can finally start writing it up one section at a time. I hope this video has been helpful. Please do check out the Study Advice website for further support for dissertations.